Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the February installment of the Renewal Museum of Art and History's History Speakers Series. Sorry, I'm off. All right, there, that's a little better. My name is Nanette Girodi, and I'm the Executive Director of OMAH. This is an exciting year for the museum as we are celebrating our 25th anniversary. Throughout the next 6 months, leading up to the official birthday on August 9th, we will be launching some community engagement initiatives to help us celebrate the past 25 years while looking forward to the next 25 years. Joining me is OMAH's History Programming Coordinator, Hannah Arndt. Hannah joined the OMAH team just last week, 6 days in. She is getting fully immersed in OMAH's programs, and we are looking forward to what she will be offering to our community. I will now turn it over to Hannah to introduce this evening's speaker. Enjoy.
We are very excited to have with us tonight as our guest speaker, Graeme Davis, who has been a registered professional forester since 1989. He joined the County of Simcoe in 2005, following positions with the Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority, Ministry of Natural Resources, Canadian Forest Services, and as a forestry consultant. Since coming to Simcoe County, he has been responsible to ensure that the Simcoe County Forest remains one of the most highly respected municipal forestry programs in Ontario. As a former president of the Ontario Professional Foresters Association, he has been recognized for the promotion and awareness of the benefits of professional forestry. With his talk, The Simcoe County Forest, A Century of Growth and Renewal, he will share the history of Simcoe County Forest and how, through a century of continued effort, the county has turned one of the most devastated landscapes in Ontario's largest community forest today. Thanks, Graeme, for joining us, and over to you.
Well, good evening, and thank you so much. Really is a pleasure to be here. I wanted to start by thanking the Aurelia Museum of Art and History for this invitation, and of course to all of you who are joining us this evening, taking the time. One of my roles, really, as both a professional forester and as the manager of Simcoe County Forest, is to explain what it is that we do and why. And so I really do appreciate this opportunity. And you certainly got a quick introduction on myself, but maybe a little bit more before I begin into my presentation about my role here at Simcoe County. And again, it was mentioned, I am a professional forester. I've been so for almost 35 years. And just to explain what that means, I'm one of approximately 600 members of an association who are licensed to practice professional forestry in Ontario. So we are a licensed profession, much the same as if you were an engineer in Ontario. So the Ontario Professional Forestry Association Ontario ensures that members are competent to practice, and most importantly, that your interest, the public interest, is protected.
Graeme, sorry to interrupt you. We can see your notes, so if you could just go to your presentation screen.
Oh, okay. I apologize.
Oh. There we go. That's perfect.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay. So my role as Simcoe County Forester is primarily to oversee the stewardship of the Simcoe County Forest. And this includes long-range planning, developing and recommending policy, operational planning and budgeting, and managing a small department totaling approximately 8 staff. I'm really responsible ultimately for the long-term sustainability and growth of the county forest, and I also have a role in protecting private woodlands through the administration of our forest conservation bylaw here at Simcoe County. And just very briefly, in particular for those who might not be local, very quickly on Simcoe County, so we understand the jurisdiction that I'm talking about here. Simcoe District, actually going back in time, which we will be shortly, was actually established in 1843 by the legislature of Upper Canada. So in effect, predates the formation of Canada. Today, Simcoe County is comprised of 16 local municipalities, the towns and the townships that make up Simcoe County proper. Population is about 530,000. Second largest county based on population and third largest based on physical size in Ontario. And you can, from the small map in the corner, we're just above the GTA and immediately above York Region. And as an upper tier municipality, the county is responsible for a range of municipal services, and including things like social housing, paramedics, waste management, etc. The lower tier municipalities are more responsible for direct services like water and sewer, local roads, fire and police, those types of things. The cities of Barrie and Aurelia are actually separate politically and administratively. However, they certainly geographically and economically form part of the county, and there are county services which are shared with those cities. So my presentation this evening is actually going to take us back through a period of about 200 years over the next 40 minutes or so. I realize that the title of my slide may have been a little bit misleading, but it's really important to go back well before the inception of our county forest, because it's really essential to understand why they exist. And if you weren't aware of this history, I hope that you'll also find that the story, that the information I'm presenting to you today really does remain relevant as we consider land use changes over time. So I'll do my best to cover the most relevant information through this time period and with what I know and understand. Of course, there'd be an opportunity for questions at the end, and I'll take a few moments as well when I'm finished just to suggest some additional resources and information that for those that may wish to dig a little deeper. I also do appreciate the land acknowledgement that we began the presentation with. I did want to raise this once again at the beginning of my presentation, primarily because it's really critical to acknowledge the indigenous peoples of this land, because it's of direct relevance given the topic that I'm presenting. And so as I do proceed, I really encourage you to think of the impact which would have occurred to those that lived amongst the forest before settlement and colonization occurred. Also, as I begin, I just wish to acknowledge a couple of individuals that have assembled much of the history and information that I'm going to present. The most significant being Ed Borkson, a former provincial forester who did extensive research a number of years ago and actually produced a document that I'll refer to later. So prior to European settlement, the Simcoe County area was really dominated by very mature, majestic forests comprised primarily of towering pine, but also significant areas dominated by maple, beech, oak, and other species. And the accounts were made at the time. These forests were just magnificent. There were accounts of a thick layer of pine needles and a massive overstory that deadened the sound of those traveling through. There were massive volumes of timber per acre, leading some of the original settlers and timber barons to suggest that the pine would last for perhaps 700 years. So the virgin white pine that was on these lands originally was first actually harvested and shipped back to Britain for use by the Navy. And these white pine were massive. One white pine cut in Innisfil Township, destined for Britain, required 14 teams of horses to haul it. And harvesting, squaring, and moving these timbers really demanded incredible skill and ingenuity. The men using the broadaxe in particular were highly skilled individuals. Very hard work, but tremendous skill and ingenuity required to fell these trees and get them all the way to market. And things developed quickly with the timber in this area. On the left is actually a photograph of a tramway that moved logs from Lake St. John to Couchiching and began in around the year 1870. And active sawmills in the Simcoe County area actually peaked in around 1873 with 114 in operation at that time across the county, producing fully 1/3 of all sawn timber in Ontario. So these mills really sprang up anywhere there was a good supply of timber, and the other critical factor was water to float the logs and also to generate the power for the mills. So areas like Severn Bridge, Hillsdale, Fesserton, New Lowell, Collingwood, Angus, Orillia, and on it went. These mills were operating, harvesting vast quantities of timber. Railways were built to move the timber, often actually forming upwards of 90% of all the material shipped. These were really boom times. Lumber trade was driving the earliest settlement patterns and developing the earliest infrastructure, including things like the water power mills, tramways, rail lines, the roads, the bridges. They were all being developed to access timber and to get them to market. Long abandoned now, there are still remnants of the original rail networks. They can still be found crisscrossing parts of Simcoe County today, for those that know where to look. But those original pine forests didn't last hundreds of years. And in fact, over a period of a few decades, much of the pine was already harvested, and the lumber business began to focus more on other species and other products. But the forest continued to be exploited, providing wood for bridges, homes, furniture, crating, and secondary products such as bark for tanning. And of course, fuel wood was critically important for heating homes. But despite all that the forests had provided, if you were a settler and your objective was to farm the land, the trees were an obstacle that was to be moved aside. And in the latter third of the 19th century, thousands of acres of formerly prime forests were literally razed. So what timber remained was piled and burned. Remaining stumps were eventually harvested and shipped to Collingwood to make turpentine. And finally, with fuel wood becoming scarce, remaining roots were actually gathered and sold in bundles at the roadside. And the drive to continue to clear land for agriculture continued. But the sandy soils, which once grew those tremendous pine forests, did not support intensive agricultural use for long, and soon barely became usable as pasture. The Angus area, for example, became cattle country, and in some areas, the only remaining use for the infertile land became berry production. However, to keep the berry crop coming along, fires had to occur. And this, unfortunately, occasionally led to devastating fires, which set parts of the Angus, Midhurst, and Orlake sand plains ablaze, eventually consuming any remaining organic material left in the soil. So skies that had often been filled with smoke of the wildfires were now also choked with dust from sandstorms. And the dry, sandy soils common throughout the uplands of Simcoe County became shifting sand dunes, rendering the land unfit for agriculture. Many area roads actually had to be plowed in the summer to clear away the sand. There's actually a photograph taken just on the very western boundary of Simcoe County and just near the Dufferin County border. And the loss of trees and woodlands and soil fertility wasn't just impacting the land. Area rivers were flooding in the spring, and yet headwater streams were drying up in the summer. The local climate was literally beginning to change. So as I noted earlier, some agricultural interests had actually recognized a problem and had begun to call for change as early as the 1870s. Two key individuals rose to the challenge, one a political figure and the other provincial staff. Provincial forester of the day, named Edward Zavitz, not only recognized the problem resulting from a lack of forest cover, he also became very adept at documenting the evidence through photography and communicating those effects. The other key figure at that time was E.C. Drury, who became Ontario Premier, and he was actually a farmer in the Crown Hill area of Simcoe County. So this individual had firsthand knowledge of the impacts that were occurring from a lack of forest cover in Simcoe County and beyond. So these two were really instrumental in initiating the efforts to reverse the many years of over-harvesting and all the devastating impacts which had resulted. There's a photograph of Drury in 1906 among some young pine trees that had been killed by fire, often the areas that had been left to regenerate and started to spring up with young trees were lost again as fires rolled through the area. So Zavitz not only documented the problems, but he also provided potential solutions. And this is a map that was included in a report that was assembled and submitted by Zavitz to the Ontario legislature in the early 20th century. The map identified the most significant wastelands in Ontario at that time. If you look at the map, you might recognize some of the areas identified here, including the Oak Ridges Moraine area along the upper reaches of Lake Ontario, and others including the Angus area, which later became home to Base Borden. So with the information provided by Zavitz and under the political direction of Drury, a program was initiated called the Agreement Forest Program in approximately 1920. And so with the initiation of this Agreement Forest Program, Simcoe County was the first jurisdiction to step up to the plate. And essentially the program provided for provincial management of lands which would be acquired by a municipality for the purpose of reestablishing and managing the lands for forestry purposes. So Simcoe County assembled the first 1,000 acres as required under the program in the Enton Mills area, and the Henry Tract became the first county forest in Ontario, with the first trees planted as pictured here in 1922. This was a ceremonial tree plant at that time. And a photograph of what Henry Tract looked like again a year after the initial trees were planted. So a lot of numbers on my slide here. I apologize that, but just wanted to focus a little bit on some of the changes through the decades, and this will help to give a little bit more understanding of our county forest and how it developed over time. So really in those early decades, and I've highlighted the first 3 decades of time after the initiation of our county forest system. So from through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, really that primary focus on land acquisition and soil stabilization was occurring, and it was really rapid expansion through those early years. As you can see, there was an abundance of inexpensive land at that time. The average price per acre only reached a high of about $8 per acre in the 1940s. There were fully over 50% of all the trees planted in the county forest over those early decades, over 10 million trees planted. And some of our largest forest tracts were purchased and planted through those years, as noted, the Henry Forest, the Bar, Wildman, Waverly, and others that were acquired and planted through those early decades. Along with that, you would need to understand that a lot of the early infrastructure to be able to plant the trees really hadn't been developed yet. So along with the county forest developed, or came massive investments in developing the supporting infrastructure, everything from seed collection and storage that began and eventually was developed at the Angus seed plant. Provincial nurseries, tree planting equipment, and expertise all developed along with the county forest in those early years. Another photograph for those that know our Orr Lake area. This is a photograph after some of the initial tree planting occurred in that area in 1930. This photograph 1931. And as I had noted earlier, fire was a significant problem, which had led to the inception of the county forest. And through those early days, with massive amounts of young conifer plantations, fire protection was really critical to the success of the program. So all of those larger problems or larger properties had fire guards designed into them. Planting plans, they were designed into all the planting plans, and these areas were maintained annually through plowing. Many of those areas still exist today and are utilized as our forest access roads. Equipment caches were put into place. Things like cisterns were developed and maintained on properties for water sources. And even in those early years, the economics of the county forest system was being considered as quite an important component. The earliest plantations actually had Christmas trees established in alternating rows between the other trees, and there were very early efforts to figure out the best spacing patterns to grow the trees effectively. Pruning was undertaken, and that type of thing. The photograph in the bottom here is actually a picture of the first load of Christmas trees, which left the county forest bar tract in the Craighurst area at that time. So a load of Christmas trees on way to market, probably in the Toronto area or further south into the States. So moving along here a little bit in time, we're into the middle next decades, the 1950s through 70s. And really the county forest system at that time, there was a tremendous amount going on. Land acquisition was continuing, tree planting continuing, as you will see. But that really critical need for some of the original soil stabilization had abated somewhat. And the objectives for growing the land base became a little bit wider. The land base was being developed and expanded partly to produce to achieve a critical economy scale for forest products and that type of thing in developed markets. Acquisition tended to be smaller properties and a little bit more scattered and more opportunistic. In the 1950s, the pace of acquisitions actually slowed a little bit. If you can see on the slide here, the price per acre had actually risen to what was considered an exorbitant price at that time of about $24 per acre. And as a result of that, actually in 1961, the province began initiating a grant program where they provided 50% of funding for land purchases for a period of time to encourage Simcoe County and other municipalities to continue to acquire more lands. By that time, the county forest was now being managed in 5 different units. Each of the forests actually had a live-in forest superintendent. The photograph on the right is the Henry Forest headquarters located on Horseshoe Valley Road. The forest on the left gives an idea of some of this very, very dry, sandy conditions that the early plantations were still being established in. There continued to be really significant investments in infrastructure and protection through those years. photograph of a pumper truck there in the top right that was housed in Angus. There was a tremendous amount of learning through those years, a lot of creativity, a lot of research. Harvesting techniques were being developed. There were still changes in the way that trees were planted and the species that were being planted. And a lot of these techniques and patterns were all revolving around the production of timber. So it was, the original intention was to stabilize the soils, but in order to make the whole system work, there was an understanding that it had to be economically viable in the longer term. But without a market for some of the early products, provincial staff were much more directly involved in some of the harvesting and production of timber at that time. On the left is a photograph of a highly managed red pine plantation, would have included thinning and pruning over the years. On the right is actually a pole yard, which was operated for many years in the Ore Lake Forest, where you had provincial staff actually harvesting and peeling some of the small poles which were sold and put into market. And continuing along in time here in the 1980s and 90s, you might note in the first column there, the amount of lands acquired had slowed through those years. Again, the price per acre had continued, but management at that time continued to focus primarily on timber production, although other values were certainly becoming much more important. In 1980, revenues actually exceeded expenditures for the Simcoe County Forest for the first time. So essentially all the investments that had been made in planting trees, acquiring land, and developing those forests, all of those expenditures began to result in a positive return in 1980. So the agreement that had originated in 1922 with the province of Ontario, the Agreement Forest Program, actually came to an end in 1996. And that was the year that Simcoe County assumed full management responsibility. And a number of things in Simcoe County led to the continued success of the forest. One of the key ones was the establishment of a reserve fund at that time, ensuring the continued reinvestment into the county forest. So the idea behind that, endorsed by County Council at the time of that transition, was that all the revenues from the forest would be reinvested back into the management of the forest. So a really, really key time. The other thing that was also, Simcoe County was very fortunate in the ability to bring staff over that were prior to that were with the Ministry of Natural Resources and began work for Simcoe County, which really ensured a seamless transition through those years. And so moving further along into the 21st century, and again, a little bit more of broader recognition of the multiple values and benefits that were associated with our county forest. Recreation policy for the first time was developed and adopted in 2006. Simcoe County Forest achieved certification to Forest Stewardship Council standards in 2010. And that certification system continues today and really provides recognition that the county forest is being managed sustainably and safely and contributing to the community in many, many ways. So fast forward to today, and Simcoe County was the first former agreement forest, and so we are the oldest and Ontario's largest. Currently approaching 34,000 acres and actually still growing. Really significant contributions economically, environmentally, and socially to the residents of the county. The whole system remains economically sustainable, and as noted, we are certified to Forest Stewardship Council standards. And just a map with the dark green showing the distribution of today's county forest. And again, if you thinking back to the inception of our forest and where some of the worst of the former wastelands were located, you start to understand a little bit more about today's distribution of the forest, why they exist in those locations today. So long-term planning really remains essential to manage our forests, with the potential for many ongoing decisions to impact the shape of the county forest in decades to come. So we look at our forests, and our planning document is looking at it through a 20-year lens. Current plan was approved in 2011 and revised recently in 2023. In many ways, however, we continue to look forward much further than that in the decisions that we make. And the mission of our forest today is continued promotion of excellence in the practice of forestry. It's about economic viability, but it's also recognizing the significant environmental benefits and the really important contributions that it makes to our quality of life in this area. And ultimately, today's county forest tries to balance these multiple values. Primary principles, however, recognized in our management plan are fairly simple. It's really the sustainability of the forest that has to come before anything else. And then it's really important that we have the large, healthy, diverse, and productive forests. They're really essential for our continued well-being. So just a little bit more succinctly, again, we really strive, and sustainability of the county forest is predicated on balancing our three primary objectives. Number one being environmental enhancement. That social benefit piece as noted. And again, this, the social benefit piece just grows and grows, and we need only think back a few years to how important our forest became through the years where we had the pandemic, and use of the forest went up significantly and became a really important respite for so many people. But that continues. It just really highlighted the importance to our residents. So the economic sustainability piece I want to spend a few more minutes on. So our primary objective here is ensuring that the forest system remains economically self-sufficient. But it also contributes to a healthy and viable wood-using industry. And again, there were some years where that wasn't the case, but it's certainly an important consideration again today. So we do harvest a lot of timber in Simcoe County today. We actually harvest many more trees today than we plant. About 2,000 acres is harvested annually. The thinning, however, is all designed to improve health, timber values, and achieve other objectives over time, including increased diversity over time. Most of that timber that we harvest is sold and processed locally, and all the revenues are reinvested back into the management of and continued growth of the system. And that as I noted, the growth has continued, and this is really what sets Simcoe County Forest apart from most other jurisdictions in Ontario. Because of our economy of scale and because of that very long-standing commitment to continued reinvestment, we've been able to continue to expand the land base. Over the previous 2 decades, that's resulted in over 5,500 acres acquired through the strategic reinvestment of all of those revenues. And a lot of that acquisition over the years, particularly over the last couple of decades, has consolidated and enlarged and connected existing pieces of county forest. And the benefits of forest management, including harvesting, are broad. And I just wanted to touch on this for a few moments. What we do is really about sustaining health and promoting resilience and diversity of our forest ecosystems. And really, professional forestry and today's forest practices are designed to mimic natural disturbance patterns. And I do want to touch on this for a minute because of, the discussion on the early part of the presentation, where the original harvesting was really exploitation in many ways in this part of the region, but today's forestry is much different. So as a forester, we work to mimic natural disturbance patterns in the way that the forest evolves, and that includes the way that we plant, harvest, tend our forests. We do conduct controlled burns today. As noted earlier, I mean, certainly fire was originally a big problem in this part of the world, but it's also a significant ecological benefit in some cases as well. One of the other benefits of the forest management more broadly is of course employment and jobs and contributions to Canada's manufacturing base. And the Simcoe County Forest directly actually creates quite a few jobs. 150 to 200 direct jobs are created from the timber that's harvested annually. And when you consider induced and indirect employment, that gets us up to approximately 500 jobs per year. Significant benefits of wood products as well. Again, all the products that were harvested from our forests, area forests, 100+ years ago, were really critically important. The wood that we harvest today from our sustainably managed forests continue to offer significant benefits to society, and particularly in the building industry when we compare to using steel and concrete in our building industry. From a carbon standpoint, in particular, wood uses less energy across its life cycle in buildings. It actually captures and stores carbon. And there are also other advantages which are becoming more and more evident. We're starting to hit a tipping point with use of mass timber and that type of thing for building a range of buildings. So starting to wrap things up here, I just wanted to put this quote up. This is again referring back to the report that Zavitz provided to the Ontario Legislature in 1909. And I would like to think that that if he was here today, he would be pretty pleased with what has become of his vision, really. In short, I mean, he argued that putting these former wastelands under forest management had many arguments. He argued it would eventually pay as a financial investment, which it has. Assist in ensuring wood supply, protecting our streams and our watersheds, providing for wildlife habitat, etc. It has really come through with his original vision. And there's been a number of times over the years where his vision and those of others has been recognized and showcased and celebrated. The photograph on the left is a cairn that still exists today. It's at the Henry Forest in the location from the original tree planting in 1922. It was erected 15 years later, actually, and this is a photograph from 1937. The one on the right actually recognizes E.C. Drury, and I did want to include this. This cairn is actually not at one of our county forests. It's erected in the center of Oro Township, just off of the Bass Lake Side Road, but it recognized the contribution of E.C. Drury, and I was pleased to meet with quite a number of the Drury family, actually, who still farm in Simcoe County and who are still incredibly proud of the legacy of E.C. Drury in this area. So on the left is our current team. On the right is our picture of our former Warden Cornell and Deputy Warden Dolan and representatives from the Canadian Institute of Forestry. And this was in 1922 as we celebrated the 100-year anniversary of the county forest. And we're also recognized by the Canadian Institute of Forestry as the forest capital of Canada for that year. So that was a really great way to celebrate our 100-year anniversary. I did just want to take a few minutes here too, and really, so I don't have a lot of time this evening to talk in more detail about some of the ongoing management priorities and how things are changing today, but things are changing, and along with the growth of our forest and continued growth and continuing population comes increasing challenges which didn't exist in the early years. Every property which we add brings increased workload, of course, with everything from property management and maintenance to managing the forest itself. And our work today to restore and manage our forests does consider a broader set of objectives. For example, some of our recent tree planting has included broader objectives. We've been recently quite involved in habitat restoration efforts for an endangered bird called the Kirtland's warbler. So it's still reforestation, it's still forest restoration, but it's with a broader focus and a broader emphasis. Things that we need to consider today in our management decisions are becoming more complex as we consider potential impacts from a changing climate. Of course, we have increasing threats from extreme weather conditions, ice storms, droughts, etc. And we have an ever increasing threat, unfortunately, from invasive exotic species, which really do threaten the long-term sustainability of our county forests and areas beyond. We have invasive insects, pathogens, plants, and vertebrates that are all adding complexity and cost to our management regime and our decision-making. And balancing the desire for more access and recreational use while still protecting the integrity of the forest is ongoing. You know, how much use is too much is a really difficult question to answer. Finally, I just wanted to recognize really that we've had unwavering public and political support, and it's really been key to the long success of today's Simcoe County Forest. And it really is amazing when I think about it. There's been a long commitment to sound science-based forest management. There's been continued investments in growth and reinvestment in the forest, and it's really been amazing that that's continued for over a century now. And this program has never been something that must be done. It's never been a mandated service at Simcoe County, and yet it has been supported for over a century. You know, during my career, I brought forward over 50 recommended property acquisitions, and all have been supported and approved by council. In particular, as you would know, there are always pressures over the years to utilize revenues for other purposes, yet there's been a continued commitment to reinvest all of the revenues from the county forest back into the forest. I'm also really fortunate to have had a great dedicated teams of professionals working along with me here at the county. And there's literally hundreds of former staff who played a role in development of the forest that we enjoy today. I'd also just quickly want to recognize another group that most folks would not consider, and that's our logging contractors. You know, we're a small staff here at Simcoe County. We depend on partnerships in so many ways. The workers who are out in the forest working to harvest and to do it in a very cautious and careful manner really do share a sense of pride in all that the county forest has become. It really shines through in all that they do, and they should be recognized for their efforts out there. Also, just want to recognize the many partners in the recreation area who support, who provide a tremendous amount of volunteer time in developing the trails out there. All of the designated trails out in the forest are done so with use agreements with area clubs. They do a tremendous amount of work and making the forest accessible for the public. And I really do thank them. And finally, for those looking to learn more about our county forest, lots of information on our website. I would like to note that we also have begun offering public tours in the forest in each and every September. We have a two-week stretch where we'll be again offering tours on a range of locations throughout the county. Also mentioned, just for those that are interested in learning more about the Agreement Forest story, Mr. Ed Borkson was put together a document. It was an Ontario publication called The Evergreen Challenge, the Agreement Forest Story, if you can locate a copy of that. And finally, if those are interested in a really detailed account of this really amazing contribution made by E.J. Zavitz, a book called 2 Billion Trees and Counting by Dr. John Bacher is a tremendous resource. Thank you very much. That.
Hey, I'll get you to stop sharing your screen. We'll do some Q&As here. Menu. Okay. So I see that we have questions coming in both the chat and the Q&A, so I'll go back and forth. I do apologize if I miss any. They're coming in quick. So I'll start with the chat and go up to the top here. Dave in Barrie says, early in the presentation, a photo you said was a log tramway. Was it a water-driven flume?
Actually, that particular tramway was not water-driven. I will apologize in not knowing what the source was, but it drove the logs up and over the rise in land between Lake St. John and Couchiching. So that particular feat of engineering was not water-driven.
Okay. From Rosemary, why was the seed plant in the county ended?
That's a great question. That's one that I can't give a specific answer to, other than, there have certainly been a whole range of changes, particularly with provincial involvement in forestry, in particular in forestry in Southern Ontario. When I started my career, I worked for the Ministry of Natural Resources, and prior to 96, of course, all the management was still being conducted through the province, through provincial staff. And the provincial tree nursery system, and then eventually the seed plant, were provincially owned and operated. So the government of the day made the decision, given the tremendous changes that had occurred over the last couple of decades, and the pullback in direct provincial involvement, decision was made to close the seed plant, unfortunately. There have been a lot of folks, a lot of particularly Forests Ontario and others that have stepped forward to try to fill the void. And we still do have trees available for reforestation in Ontario, but it is a very different system today than it was a decade or two or three ago. So.
Okay, also from Rosemary, hardwood trees are taking over after the evergreens have been harvested. Are the evergreens going to be planted again?
That's a really great question as well. In some cases, yes. Again, I talked a little bit about forestry and about mimicking natural disturbance patterns. The landscape that we have to plant, if we're reforesting an area that had once been cleared for agricultural use, and it's dry, it's open, it's sandy soils, things like red pine are particularly conducive. And they're also particularly conducive because they're not shade tolerant, or they require full sun in order to grow. So in many ways, our pine forests have been very long-term cover crops that have created the conditions through management for these other species to seed in. So it's actually very difficult to go back in time on these properties and replant to things like red pine. Now, we do plant white pine and other species that are more conducive to growing in those different conditions. And we do still acquire lands, and as noted, and in some cases we have opportunities to start from scratch, and we would use some of the lessons learned over the decades. But in most cases, our plantations do transition into other types of forests, more natural forests over time. So replanting conifer is not common, although it does happen in some cases.
From Mary, is there a reason that why Copeland Forest is not part of the Simcoe Forest Management?
There's a great reason. It is actually provincially owned. We have a complex network of land ownership in this part of the world. The Copeland Forest actually comes from the Copeland family. It was actually owned by the Copeland family for decades, and actually supported a mill and a harvesting industry right on that property for many years. It was actually sold and purchased by the province many years ago, and continues to be provincial or crown lands. And there are other crown lands also scattered through Simcoe County that are under different, they are managed and owned by the province, and so not by Simcoe County. And Copeland is simply one of those properties.
Pat Williams wonders what type of harvesting is used?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
What type of harvesting is used?
What type of harvesting is used? There are a range of ways that harvesting is conducted. Most are, well, in particular in our softwood, like in our pine plantations and pine forests, it's primarily mechanical, meaning that there would be a machine that would a harvesting machine that would fell the trees with a mechanical chainsaw and an operator inside the machine, and it would be processed and brought out to the forest edge for trucking and that type of thing. But every situation is unique. We do have a couple of local mills that, as noted, depend quite a bit on county timber, and have their own equipment that they harvest the trees mechanically, as noted. Some of the hardwood trees can be felled with a simple chainsaw, and pulled out by skidders. So there's a range of technologies, there's a range of operators, but certainly more and more of the operations are being done mechanically.
How do the forests, sorry, this is from Maryland. How do the forests balance animal habitat and migration pattern with human activities in the forest? Are forests connected to support animal movements?
That's a great question. So as noted, I mean, the county forest system continues to evolve and grow. And I had noted as well that we continue to invest in land acquisition, and usually, again, what we're trying to do is enlarge and connect existing forest areas, and those larger and connected blocks of forest are often important for different habitat types and for migration of wildlife, etc. There's no question about it. These areas are also used for trail corridors, and there is a balance there. We are not specifically wildlife managers, although we do work in concert with the Ministry of Natural Resources and some of the monitoring that goes on with respect to wildlife and wildlife patterns. We do, however, manage quite explicitly in a couple of different ways. First of all, to create the forest system that provides that habitat in the first place. We take a fairly broad approach to trying to provide for a range of habitat types, and a range of types is important for different species. And then when we get right down to site-specific issues with respect to management decisions, restricting harvesting at certain times of the years to protect more sensitive species. We have many areas that we would not harvest at all that are more sensitive from from a habitat standpoint, right down to protecting stick nests that are located when tree markers are out on the ground and identifying nesting habitat and those sorts of things. So there's a whole range of ways that we manage towards broader diversity over the long time, and yet at the site specific point, we do everything we can to try to promote diversity and protect specific habitat.
Is a Kirtland's warbler colony established in Simcoe County?
There is no colony per se. So Kirtland's warbler, just to back up for a moment, is a very rare endangered species. It historically nested in Simcoe County, but had not been known to for many decades. We got involved through a partnership with the Canadian Wildlife Service and many others, actually, to see what we could do in Simcoe County to create nesting habitat, which these birds are quite specific in what they're looking for nesting. So we have been quite engaged in creating actually the first 2 projects of their kind actually in Canada to try to create nesting habitat. We've actually had birds visit the site. We haven't been able to confirm that they've been nesting just yet. So we do have nesting birds through a lot of efforts that have gone on in the United States and Wisconsin and Michigan over a number of decades. And there's additional work being done down in the Caribbean, which is the overwintering ground. So we're really part of an international network here in trying to bring this bird back from the endangered status that it still exists in Canada.
I think I see. So I haven't even touched the questions yet. I'm just in the chat, and I keep seeing I have 7 new messages in the chat. So I'm going to take 2 more from the chat, and then I'll switch over and take maybe 3 or 4 from the questions section. So I apologize to anyone that we're going to miss, but we'll see how we're doing after that. Just a quick comment from Jim Farrell. Excellent presentation, Graeme. A truly inspiring story of the resilience of land if there is a commitment to recovery and reforestation. Simcoe County should be justifiably proud of their long-term commitment to stewardship and your business model. I do wonder if we could do something as visionary today. I would like to think so. Nice. Okay, next question. Is there a museum of forestry in Simcoe for photographs?
There is a Simcoe County Museum that is owned and operated by the County of Simcoe. And actually, quite recently, it just opened to the public a couple of years ago. We do have a dedicated building called the Red Pine House. It's one of the outbuildings on the county property, and it is dedicated to telling exactly the story that I've just told. So it's a history and a story I think that a lot of those in Simcoe County are proud of and take seriously and want to see shared. So the answer is yes. There is a story to be told, and our county museum does the best that they can to tell that story.
Great. From Sue, we enjoy walking and snowshoeing in the county tracks and are very grateful for the trails that have been created. Is there a fear that the multitude of mountain bike trails that crisscross an area are diminishing the wildlife in that area?
Yeah, that's a great question and a difficult answer. And again, we try very hard to balance all the interests out there, and I will fully admit it is a difficult balance to strike. Does it impact the wildlife? It's possible that it impacts some wildlife. I would note that trail development in our county forest has slowed. It did really rush forward for a number of years. Again, we have tremendous clubs out there of a number of kinds, and they work with us quite closely. We do have a system of identifying more sensitive sites We call them our high conservation value forests. So this could be anything from a sensitive habitat area to a wetland, to any number of things that we want to protect because of their sensitivity. And we do work to direct any trail development away from those areas. So it is a balance. It's impossible to give a yes or a no answer. There are always impacts from every use in the forest. We do what we can to balance those impacts for sure.
Great. I'm just trying to see if I can do a screenshot to send some of these to you later, because like I said, there are quite a few coming in. I'm going to read one more comment, and then I'll do one more question from the chat, and then I'll move on to the questions. So I'm an 86-year-old pharmacist, and in the late 50s, I got to know Mr. Zavitz very well. He was a client in the pharmacy in which I worked as a student. Then he then realized that I was interested in his work. He presented me with his book. Unfortunately, I have lost track of the book. He spent his retirement years living with his daughter in North Toronto. So I thought that was interesting. Okay, last question from here. Garlic mustard seems to be more prevalent in the forest all the time. What threat does this pose, do you think?
Garlic mustard absolutely is proliferating. It is just one, unfortunately, of a great many invasive exotic plants that we do our best to manage and mitigate. Garlic mustard is one in particular that I think the experts are perhaps a little bit divided on just how impactful garlic mustard specifically will be in the longer term. Again, we do what we can manage and keep it at bay on our more sensitive sites. I will be honest in that we have other plants that I'm more concerned about today, primarily both common and glossy buckthorn in particular, and there are a few others which really are having a very, very devastating impact on the long-term sustainability of our forests and the way that the diversity of the forest is changing over time. So garlic is one, but we have unfortunately many other plants that we do our best to manage and mitigate those impacts.
Okay. What is the greatest challenge faced today?
That's a fairly broad question. I think probably I would say the effects of climate change, as in so many other areas. When we think about the long-term trajectory of our forest, the challenges in keeping it healthy and productive will climate change and all the changes and stresses that are coming along with that. And I could have said invasive species, but I think our invasive species issues are also partly a result of climate change. And the two are somewhat interrelated there. So again, we just need to consider all these factors. We need to try to make the best decisions that we can with the information that we have, and continue to move forward. I still think, despite all those challenges, the future of our county forest system is really bright. So I'm quite confident of that.
Good. That's good to hear. Ninka is wondering, how do we find out in which tracts trees are being harvested for safe hiking purposes?
You can absolutely go to the county website, just simcoe.ca. There is a link right from there to the mapping resources, and our forest and recreation map will always show where we have active harvest operations so that you can avoid those areas. That's a great question.
And then last question, I guess, do you partner with local land trusts?
Do we partner with local land trusts? We are certainly aware of local land trusts. We don't have any direct partnerships. We do have some direct on the ground partnership with Couchiching Conservancy with some joint lands. Our local land trusts are tremendous assets for us in Simcoe County, and they do a tremendous job on identifying and finding ways of of protecting particularly sensitive lands. So their efforts are certainly recognized. There are no direct partnerships at this point in time, however.
Okay. I will ask one more question just because I find it interesting myself. What are some of the positions within the forestry team? Is there a policy role? Any advice for someone interested in this field from a policy perspective?
Well, we are a relatively small group here at Simcoe County. The types of position, I'm a forester. I am involved in some of the day-to-day decisions that we're making out in the field, but more and more that's being relegated to 2 operations foresters. So we've split the county geographically, where we have 2, foresters working more directly on the ground than I do. We've also got some very capable forest technicians here that are doing more of the work on the ground with the day-to-day inventory, mapping, invasive species monitoring and management, and those types of activities, property maintenance, which is a never-ending bunch of work for sure. From a policy standpoint, directly at a municipality like this is probably somewhat limited. That would certainly fall primarily within my role as the county forest to bring revisions to our recreation policy, for example, or the policy around land securement and protection and those types of things, the overall forest management plan. Probably on broader policy initiatives, there might be more opportunity at the provincial level. There's a different role for the province, for example, on the policy file. Although again, in Southern Ontario today, there's very, very little direct provincial involvement anymore. That's really changed over the last 2 to 3 decades.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for answering all of those questions. And once again, I'm sorry to anyone whose question didn't get answered, but I would like to pass it on to Trish now for the closing remarks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Graeme, for your informative talk tonight on the history of Simcoe County Forest and for the work that you and your team are doing to ensure the Simcoe County Forest remains one of our most highly respected municipal forest programs in Ontario. It was a very enlightening talk, so thank you so much. On behalf of the History Committee, who facilitate the OMAH Speaker Series, I thank everyone in attendance for your continued support. For those who are watching tonight, you may be non-members, but you may wish to consider becoming a member of the museum and reap all the benefits membership brings, including the receipt of the museum's newsletter, which includes local history articles researched and written by the History Committee members. In celebration of Black History Month, we recently acknowledged the contributions of Ron and Ann Harrison, descendants of those who traveled the Freedom Trail in Canada, and their ongoing work in educating our community about the Underground Railroad to a network that helped African Americans to escape slavery and make their way to freedom in Canada. So next up in our speaker series, on Wednesday, March 20th at 7 p.m. on Zoom, our guest speaker will be Dr. Cynthia Wesley Esquimaux, who will present her talk, The Reality of Reconciliation in Canada and Abroad. Cynthia serves as the first Indigenous Chair for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada for Lakehead University, where she continues to develop pathways forward to reconciliation across Canada. Cynthia has worked on the Truth and Reconciliation in Canada for many, many years. So join the discussion and share your thoughts on this important and compelling topic. Once again, thank you for your attendance tonight, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Take care. Bye-bye.